Welcome back, folks. It's good to have you back with me here in U.S. history, and we are now going to spend some time focusing on one of the first major global events of U.S. history, and actually world history, and that is World War I. World War I took place between about 1914 and 1920 and involved almost all of Europe, and the United States and Canada also were drug in. And it set the stage and kind of paved the way for ultimately World War II, which was an even bigger conflict in the 1930s and 40s. And this is really where we turn the corner and start talking about modern U.S. history. World War I is kind of the turning point where we become a global nation and specifically a superpower. So we're going to talk a little bit about how that happened, how the United States got involved in World War I, and what led up to it in terms of Europe. So let's take a look in terms of where Europe was at the outbreak of war. Europe was divided into a system of alliances. So all the different countries in Europe, and obviously Europe is a small place with lots of different people and lots of different cultures and lots of different countries, in order to make themselves more powerful, these smaller nations became allied with other nations in Europe. And so we had two major alliances that were kind of staring each other down. One was called the Triple Alliance, and that was predominantly Austro-Hungary and Germany. And the other was the Western Allies, which was predominantly France and the United Kingdom or England. And so those two nations really were kind of squared off in terms of who was going to be the most powerful in Europe. What led to World War I was something that happened in the Balkans, the area of Yugoslavia, and really it happened with the assassination of the Archduke of Yugoslavia named Ferdinand of Serbia. And he was a kind of a small prince essentially, but his assassination by an anarchist led to Germany and Russia squaring off and brought other nations into it. So the fact that we had all these nations kind of intertwined in this alliance system brought into this larger global conflict, even though it was over a very small issue. The Germans wanted to be the first to strike, and they did. The German plan was to very quickly knock out France and other nations on the Western Front, and then be able to work on Russia on the Eastern Front. So they wanted to very quickly take over and see if they could then take over the rest of Europe. The United States obviously was not involved. We're an ocean away. The Atlantic Ocean separates us, and this is the time before plane travel, and so we are nicely insulated from the events over in Europe. But obviously we also have a relationship with Europe, so we had to figure out what we wanted to do. America had, for the most part, been neutral in these issues and had not taken a particular side, but ultimately we're pro-British. So we felt, as a nation, a little more connected to Britain and France than we did to Germany. The British blockade was done to try to make sure that Germany couldn't get itself refilled and refitted with materials. And during this blockade, the German U-boats or submarines sunk a number of British ships. One was the Lusitania, and the Lusitania had a number of Americans on it. So we had Americans killed by Germans in World War I, which was something that made us kind of think again about being on the pro-British side. So the United States actually ultimately comes into the war in 1917, and we declare war on Germany and its allies and come in on the side of France and Britain. Now this is 3 years into World War I, so World War I has been going on in Europe for 3 years, but the fact that the U.S. rushes in is going to have a big impact. On the home front, back in the United States, we had a number of things happening. All of a sudden we went from a peacetime economy to a wartime economy. So we have military buildup. We have something called the Selective Service that starts to try to get men into the war. We have women starting to take over factory jobs that the men vacated when they go into the war, and African Americans are serving, although African Americans up through World War II are serving in segregated units. So no whites and blacks are serving together. However, African Americans are certainly doing their part for the United States. The industrial output increases in the United States. It's mostly building things for the military. It's building things like tanks and trucks and munitions and things of that sort. And that really changes the workforce. All of a sudden we have women in the workforce, minorities in the workforce more than they ever have been before. And that certainly is going to change some things in terms of what happens after the war ends. We also have the government having to sell the war. A lot of people are still undecided about whether or not we should be involved in sending over our young men to die in Europe over a European issue. So the government starts its propaganda campaign. And also civil liberties are curtailed. The government shuts down the ability to, in a lot of cases, protest against the war and protest against the government because it doesn't want that to be seen. It wants America to be seen as a unified country. As I said, America joins the war in 1917 and makes an instant impact with this new country, this new amount of material coming in. It really tips the scale. Combat in World War I was horrific and ugly, and it really had the brand new technology, things like the machine gun and the biplane and things like that, with old tactics. And so we saw just men being mowed down in ugly, ugly battles. Men living for weeks and weeks in trenches, 150 feet apart from each other in the two different sides, living in the trenches in France, and these new technologies that I talk about. So America comes in and certainly tips the scale. Russia also leaves the war, leaves the Allied side, which America and Britain and France have joined, in 1917 in order to deal with some of its own internal issues, the Russian Revolution. And we see some of these battles that I talked about, like the Battle of the Argonne Forest in eastern France, where thousands and thousands of men die over a few feet of land. Ultimately, the war ends. We have something called the armistice. It's an agreement between the powers to end the war. Germany, Austro-Hungary, and the other nations surrender to the Western Allies and are expected to pay fairly severe reparations. They have to make war payments, damage payments back to the other nations. Woodrow Wilson, our president at the time, however, uses this as an opportunity to try to build a system in Europe so that something like this never happens again. He proposes something called the League of Nations. And right now we have something called the United Nations in New York, which hopefully you've heard of, where all the nations take place and try to debate issues that are important to the world. This was the precursor to that. This was the thing that happened before that. And it was not particularly effective. It led to the United Nations, though, and it's a good idea, getting all the nations of the world together to try to solve problems. The Treaty of Versailles was officially the surrender document, and the United States rejected that treaty because it felt it was too harsh on Germany, and Germany wouldn't be able to live up to the requirements of the treaty. And we'll see a little foreshadowing here. We'll see that this treaty is really important as we talk about Adolf Hitler and World War II down the road. So what was the impact of the war on America? Well, we talked a little bit about economic issues. After the war, economic woes came into place. Generally, during a war, you have a lot of economic excitement and movement because you're building stuff. Afterwards, we had inflation and strikes. Men came back wanting their jobs, but women and minorities oftentimes were in those jobs, so they had to be laid off. We have a lot of racial unrest. African Americans felt like it wasn't fair. They were asked to go and fight and die for the United States, but they don't have rights back at home. We have a lot of anti-immigration feelings, especially against Germans and people of Germanic descent. And we start to then think a little bit about something called the Red Scare, which is dealing with communism. And now Russia is this communist nation in Europe, and we have to deal with that. And essentially, the end of the war leads also to the end of progressivism. We start to slip into a much more conservative, much more business-focused climate, which will ultimately end with the Great Depression, which we'll talk about next time. So that's a little bit about World War I. You'll learn a lot more in your reading this week, and look forward to talking to you some more next time.